My friend Terry Wolberg, a Los Angeles-based psychotherapist, notes that in the face of a tantrum or other difficult behavior, we might consider what could have caused our child to act in such a way. What needs, desires, or feelings are motivating her behavior? Did she have a hard day at school or difficulty with a friend or in a class? Is she overtired and not feeling well? If we ask ourselves these or similar questions, we become more compassionate and kinder with our words. By talking with our children, we help them understand what is motivating their own behavior, and we also help them organize and make sense of their internal experience. Does this mean that we don't discipline? No, of course not. But as we verbally acknowledge the needs behind their behavior, we can help ensure that our reactions are communicated from a place of understanding and love, while we also still hold the line. As the child psychologist Miriam Adahan wisely advises, remind yourself that your child performs thousands of acts of self-discipline, which you do not notice. There are thousands of times when he did come when you called, did eat the food he may not have wanted because you wanted him to, did give up some pleasurable activity to do your bidding even though it was painful for him at the time, did not bother you when you were busy, and did not fight or argue with you or his sibling. Of course, you may think, how many parents have ever looked into the face of their sleeping child and wanted to do anything but help, protect, and cherish him or her? Yet no honest parent can say that he or she has never had an outburst of unchecked anger or never made a demeaning or insensitive remark to a child. What's more, many of us carry at least a few scars inflicted by words from our own parents. A woman, highly self-conscious about being flat-chested throughout her teen years, still quails at the memory of her father's teasing. When are you going to grow breasts and be a real woman? An accomplished lawyer, who as a young boy used to create minor disturbances in school, still chafes at his father's unkind threat. Don't assume that we love you. In this household, you have to earn our love. Eleanor Roosevelt never forgot how her mother would speak lovingly to her younger brothers, but not to her. If a visitor was there, the First Lady confided to friends, she might turn and say she is such a funny child, so old-fashioned, we always call her Granny, wanted to sink through the floor in shame. Woman I know recalls being told by her mother, don't smile or laugh when you're in public. Your buck teeth stick out, and you look terrible. To this day, whenever she laughs, and you can be sure that she almost always tries to suppress the impulse, this woman still covers her mouth with her hand. Some of these examples of hurtful words said by parents sound extreme, and it's not hard to recognize the tremendous power they have to wreak psychological damage. The enormous attention focused in recent years on the physical and sexual abuse of children is deserved. But fortunately, children who suffer such abuse are still a definite minority. However, the victims of deeply hurtful and perhaps oft-repeated comments are far more numerous. Because this form of parental cruelty is rarely viewed as the serious matter it is, it's less frequently discussed. This is unfortunate, since the victims often carry its scars to their grave. In the Jewish tradition, the prohibition against publicly shaming others applies as strongly to children as to adults. In a world in which there is reason to believe that little attention was paid to children's emotional needs, the 12th century Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides ruled, do not humiliate your fellow in public, whether he or she is a minor or an adult. Indeed, children are more vulnerable to all attacks, including humiliation. Therefore, if parents need to admonish a child, they should do so in private, just as they would with an adult. Parents who are quick-tempered must be especially careful not to violate this prohibition, for example, by berating a child in public or in the presence of his peers. Unfortunately, many parents routinely violate this ethical norm. Some even humiliate their children for behavior that is beyond their control, such as learning disabilities or other disorders. Middle-aged man in his 50s recalled his shame and rage when he was 6 years old and still a bedwetter, and his father said to him in front of the whole family, "We can't go on vacation and stay in a motel or at friends' homes because you still wet the bed. You are ruining the summer for all of us." Dr. Abraham Twersky, a psychiatrist who knew the man, commented, "This was a totally unfair rebuke because he was unable to control his bedwetting," and the man said that his father's vicious criticism drove a stake into his heart. What was even worse was that this was said in the presence of his siblings. Thoughtless remarks such as this can have untold impact on a child with long-term residuals of acrimony. I am not suggesting that parents must speak only kind and supportive words to their children, even when they act badly. They definitely have an obligation to teach their children right from wrong and to correct them when they misbehave. In Hebrew, the word for parentor comes from the same root as that for teach or more, an etymological suggestion that the parent's primary role is to teach. Indeed, parents who don't know how to teach and when to speak up and correct run the risk of raising unethical children who will turn into unethical adults. The book of Samuel tells the story of Adonijah, son of King David, who, during the last year of his father's life, goes around Jerusalem boasting that soon he will be king. What was the root of his callous arrogance and disrespect toward his still living and reigning father? According to the Bible, David bore some of the blame because, throughout his son's life, his father had never scolded him and said, "Why did you do that?" The biblical choice of words here is significant. The text doesn't say that David's error lay in not denouncing Adonijah for his poor character and selfish nature. So all-encompassing an attack probably would have been demoralizing and thus counterproductive. Rather, David's error, the Bible suggests, was in not criticizing Adonijah's bad acts as they occurred, in never asking him, "Why did you do that?" By restricting criticism to a specific bad act, a parent is unlikely to damage a child's self-image. Admittedly, finding the golden mean between being critical but not overly uncritical is difficult. But the alternative choice of many parents vacillating between broad and destructive deprecatory comments and tolerating behavior that shouldn't be tolerated is far worse. Several years ago, close friends found that they were constantly criticizing their 10-year-old daughter for perpetually leaving her clothes strewn around her room, grabbing food with her hands straight off the plate, and seldom using her fork, demanding things without saying please, responding thank you, and she received them, not looking at people when they spoke to her, constantly breaking into her parents' conversations. Even when they were on the phone one night, her father realized that from the time his daughter came home from school until she fell asleep, he and his wife were subjecting her to one long litany of complaints. He thought about how he would have felt had every aspect of his work and personality been criticized this way by his employer. Would his behavior really have improved, or would he have lost all faith in his own competence? Would he have believed that his boss's constant rebukes were motivated by a loving desire for him to improve himself? Would he have concluded that his boss probably didn't like him very much and had a low opinion of his capabilities? The following day, the couple decided that instead of trying to turn their daughter into a perfect 10-year-old, they would focus their efforts for the time being on the one area about which they cared most, the child's moral character. From then on, politeness and gratitude, saying please and thank you, became their one non-negotiable demand of her. They realized that unless their daughter's behavior improved in that area, she would grow up to be an unpleasant, unkind, and ultimately intolerable person. However, if she ended up a sloppy and even disorganized person, that would be unfortunate, but better than feeling rejected by her own parents. Also, there would be time to work on those traits later. Through their behavioral transformation, the parents demonstrated that they had internalized Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's penetrating insight. A torn jacket is soon mended, but hard words bruise the heart of a child. Parents commonly err not only in criticizing harshly, but also in forgetting to praise. This applies, by the way, even if your children are well into middle age.
In Signs of the Times, the religious writer Gottfried von Kronenberger relates an incident about a young mother who confessed to her pastor, "My little boy often misbehaves, and I have to scold him. But one day he had been especially good. That night, after I tucked him in bed and started downstairs, I heard him crying. I found his head buried in the pillow. Between sobs he asked, "Mommy, haven't I been a pretty good boy today?" That question went through me like a knife, the mother told her pastor. I had been quick to correct him when wrong, but when he had behaved, I hadn't noticed. I had put him to bed without a word of praise. The parental formula favored by some parents of heavy on the criticism and light on the praise causes children to go through life feeling inadequate as human beings and unworthy of being loved. The psychologist Haim Janot advises mothers and fathers, if you want your children to improve, let them overhear the nice things you say about them to others. This should be obvious, but not to some people. I know a woman who was raised by a verbally abusive mother whose constant criticism was vicious. It was only after the mother's death at an early age that the girl learned from her mother's friends that the mother would read aloud to them letters the girl had written from camp, beautifully expressed letters in which the mother clearly took pride, a pride which would have been immensely meaningful to her daughter had she had thought to express it. Also be certain that your children are made aware of nice things others say about them. I once came across an autobiographical recollection of a great pianist who remembered one day, as a child, overhearing his piano teacher tell his mother, "The boy has golden hands." From that day, the pianist recalled, he regarded his own hands with a certain awe. No matter how difficult a challenge he confronted at the keyboard, he was undaunted. After all, he had golden hand. Closely related to the problem of parents being overly critical of their children is the tendency of some parents to verbally wound their children through comparisons. Your brother never spills things. He tries to be careful. Why don't you? Your sister always says please and thank you. I wish you would be polite and considerate like her. Your brother and sister don't get into trouble in school. You're the only one who's always causing us aggravation. These sorts of comparisons spring to the lips of many parents, yet I can think of few more obvious violations of the golden rule. How many men would appreciate being told by their wives, Mary's husband, Tom, also works long hours, but he doesn't complain every time she asks him to help around the house. And how many women would like to hear their bosses say, if you could only learn to be more like Jill or Laura and be more innovative in your work. Throughout my childhood, until I went to college, I was a poor student. I tended to find schoolwork boring, and while I would read books about topics in which I was interested, I rarely did homework in those subjects in which I had no interest. My lackadaisical performance caused my parents considerable consternation. Two of my older cousins, who attended the same school, had graduated as valedictorians. My sister, also older than me, was very studious and ranked near the top of her class. On several occasions, our school's principal berated me in front of the whole class, no less. "What is the matter with you? You're a terrible student. I don't understand why you can't do even half as well as your cousins and sister. Your father's a scholar. Your grandfather's a scholar. What happened to you?" Needless to say, his words did not induce any improvement in my academic performance. I remain, however, permanently grateful to my parents. Frustrated as they must have been by my mediocre school performance, and as often as they spoke to me about taking my schoolwork more seriously, I never recall them bringing my cousins and sister into the discussion. My parents intuitively understood that every criticism that can be directed toward a child can be made without reference to another sibling. I am also grateful to my grandfather, the rabbinical scholar to whom my principal referred, who one day said to the principal and told me that he had said it, "You must not say such things to Joseph. One day he will become an important man and do great things, and you will regret your words." Perhaps I haven't quite lived up to my grandfather's prophecy. Who could? But I know that what I have achieved in life is due in no small measure to the healing, supportive, and sometimes critical words of my parents and to my grandfather's absolute faith in me. Comparisons with siblings are detrimental for another reason. Whether intended or not, such comparisons imply a parental preference for the other sibling. I often ask my audiences how many of them grew up feeling that one or both of their parents preferred one child over another. Many hands go up, and whenever those who felt less loved start to speak, deep expressions of pain gush forth. I have also learned over the years that the favored children are frequently unhappy with their parents' favoritism. It often caused their siblings to resent them. Also, they frequently grew up feeling that their parents' happiness depended on their achievements. Parents have an obligation to ensure that all their children feel equally or, perhaps better, as my friend Rabbi Erwin Killa suggests, uniquely, love and appreciate. Even if, in the privacy of their bedroom, they sometimes express a preference for one child over another, most parents know that such a preference is often temporary. Then they do not convey a feeling of love and appreciation. The damage they inflict is often lifelong. For with what greater disadvantage can a child go out into the world than with the feeling that even her own mother and father don't really love her? In addition, comparing children undermines family unity. Instead of making the children feel that they are part of one united family, one for all, and all for one, children come to see themselves as competitors for a finite amount of parental love and approval. This type of competition rarely brings out the best in anyone, and it increases the likelihood that such children will not be close to each other when they grow up. As noted earlier, the Bible tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons and made no effort to disguise his favoritism. He even had a special and exceedingly beautiful coat woven for Joseph. This and other acts of favoritism helped inflame Jacob's other sons against Joseph, and eventually they arranged to sell him as a slave into Egypt, while telling their father that a wild animal had killed him. The rabbis of the Talmud concluded from this episode that a man should never single out one of his children for favorable treatment, for because of the 2 extra coins worth of silk woven into the special coat for Joseph, Joseph's brothers became jealous of him, and one thing led to another until our ancestors became slaves in Egypt. On raising truthful children, probably the most common reason children lie to their parents is that they are afraid of what might happen if they tell the truth. 2 parents were exasperated by their 5-year-old son's tendency to blame others, including ghosts, for mischievous things he did, such as writing with crayon on the wall. They assured him that they would not get angry at him as long as he told the truth, but would be upset if he lied. After repeated reassurances from the parents, the boy started telling the truth consistently. 2 years later, when the mother pressed him as to whether he had taken some important papers off her desk, he said, "Mommy, you know I don't lie anymore." The German author Johann Paul Friedrich Richter wrote 2 centuries ago, "If a child tells a lie, tell him that he has told a lie, but don't call him a liar. If you define him as a liar, you break down his confidence in his own character." My friend Dr. Isaac Hirschkopf, a psychiatrist, has argued that far better even than telling a child he has lied is asking him questions in a Socratic style. Once the conclusion is obvious, the child can rescind the lie and rectify it. When I asked Dr. Hirschkopf how that works in real life, he told me of an incident when one of his daughters, who was, as he recalled, either 3 or 4 years old at the time, returned from nursery school with an expensive crayon set that he and his wife had not bought for her. When the parents asked where she got it, the girl answered, "I found it." "Where did you find it?" "In school." "Where in school?" "In an empty classroom." "Why was the classroom empty?" "Our class had left." "Do you think someone might have left it behind?" "Maybe." "Any idea who?" "I don't know." "Did any of your classmates have that expensive crayon set?" "Maybe." "Who?" "Devora." "Do you think therefore that Devora left it behind?" "Maybe." "Maybe?" "Probably." "What do you think you should do?" Note that they asked, "What do you think you should do?" rather than "What do you want to do?" "I should give it back to her." How will you explain not giving it back to her the same day? "I'll tell her the truth, that I took it home." By not telling her what to do, Dr. Hirschkopf noted, she could take full credit for returning the set, and by engaging in a Socratic dialogue, we, the parents, didn't have to back her into a corner and force her to lie, and we didn't have to point out her lies. As regards the words children direct to parents, it is worth recalling that the 5th of the 10 Commandments legislates, "Honor your father and mother." Although on 3 other occasions the Hebrew Bible commands love of God, of one's neighbor, and of the stranger, it does not command love of parents. In so intimate a relationship, it is hard to do so. Either love is present or it isn't. What the Bible does demand is a measure of respect that can be expressed even during those painful periods when love might be lacking. It means that even when a child is furious at his parents, he doesn't cut them out of his life, except perhaps in those rare instances when a child has suffered physical, sexual, or serious emotional abuse at a parent's hands, and when she expresses anger, she avoids making comments like, "I hate you," or "I wish I had had decent parents, not you." Many children grow up having been deeply hurt by their parents' words. By the time they become adolescents and adults, many have learned how to fight back also with words. Usually, they are quite successful at hurting their parents in return, although the greater their success, the more pain they usually cause themselves. In his book My Daddy Was a Pistol, and I'm a Son of a Gun, the late Louis Grizzard recalls going through his father's meager possessions at the hospital where he died. In the dead man's coat, Grizzard found a letter that he had evidently been carrying for a long time. It was a letter from me. I had written it 6 months before. It was short, maybe a page typewritten. Down at the end, I had given him some grief about straightening out his life. I told him I would have to think twice about inviting him to my house again if he didn't promise he wouldn't show up drinking. I just signed my name. I didn't say love or anything. I had just signed my name like I was a real hardass. I still wonder why he carried such a letter around with him for so long. Maybe he kept it as a reminder to do better. I don't know. Maybe he kept it to remind himself his only son was turning on him. Whatever, I never forgave myself for that letter. I can't get it out of my head he died not knowing how much I loved him. Chapter 10 The Cost of Public Humiliation. Whoever shames his neighbor in public, it is as if he shed his blood. Babylonian Talmud, Bava Meziah. Some 1,800 years ago in Israel, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the leading scholar of his age, was delivering an important lecture when suddenly he found himself in a very aggravating circumstance. A member of the audience who had eaten a large amount of garlic was emitting such an unpleasant odor that the rabbi found it difficult to concentrate. Rabbi Judah abruptly stopped speaking and called out, "Whoever ate the garlic, leave." Almost immediately, Rabbi Hia, a scholar only slightly less prominent than the speaker, rose from his seat and started toward the back. Many other listeners, mortified by Rabbi Hia's public embarrassment, followed him out, and the lecture was canceled. The next morning, Rabbi Judah's son confronted Rabbi Hia and criticized him for spoiling his father's lecture. "God forbid that I would ever trouble your father," Rabbi Hia responded. "How can you deny what you did?" the son answered. "Wasn't it you who stood up when my father demanded that the one who had eaten the garlic leave?" "I stood up only to avoid the public humiliation of the person whose breath was bothering your father. Since I already have a certain status among the rabbis, I was willing to accept the embarrassment of being publicly singled out like that. Imagine, though, if the person who had eaten the garlic was a rabbi of lesser stature than me, or worse, a student. That person would have been deeply humiliated, and likely would have become an object of mockery. Asterisk, so far we have been examining the cost of harsh words spoken in anger or criticism. But what of the occasional cruelties to which we are all prone? In the preceding example, Rabbi Hia was concerned with more than just guarding the unfortunate garlic eater's dignity. He also wished to prevent Rabbi Judah from violating one of Judaism's most serious ethical offenses, humiliating a fellow human being. Whoever shames his neighbor in public, the Talmud teaches, it is as if he shed his blood. The analogy is deemed apt because a shamed person's skin blanches as the blood drains from his face. The analogy is apt for yet another reason. Sometimes a person who feels extremely humiliated wishes he were dead. Public humiliation can and has led to suicide. In a case that received national attention in 2010, Tyler Clementi, a freshman at Rutgers University, jumped off the George Washington Bridge after he learned that his roommate set up a webcam to catch him in a homosexual encounter in the room they shared. The roommate then used social media to encourage others to watch Clementi's encounter. Clementi's case is, of course, not a singular occurrence. Some years ago, People magazine reported on the suicide of an overweight teenage girl who had been mocked. I'm not using the word teased because it does not adequately convey the maliciousness of mockery with cruel nicknames and comments by her peers. The article prompted this letter. As a teenager, I too was tortured by my fellow students. I was an overweight teen and was abused constantly. I could not escape it. Teachers witnessed this over and over again and did nothing. The principal told me her hands were tied. I thought of suicide, but luckily I never did it. I wish all teenagers who tease others could have it happen to them so they could feel the pain and humiliation they inflict. I am signing this letter with the name they chose to torture me with for 6 years. How would you like to be known to an entire school as Big Bertha? Not surprisingly, Jewish ethics, and I would hope all ethical systems, forbids calling someone by a nickname that hurts them, and people have the right to determine which nicknames hurt them. Teaching this to children is particularly important since they often inflict cruel nicknames on their peers. Even when they note the terrible effects that public humiliation can have on its victims, not enough journalists, prominent figures, and opinion makers, and for that matter, ordinary citizens, seem to feel abhorrence at the thought of shaming others. In this chapter, I focus on both recent and not so recent events to indicate how long-standing a problem public humiliation is. In 1959, a prominent businessman donated $500,000 to a university in St. Louis, Missouri. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch assigned reporters to write a feature about him. The reporters soon discovered that the man had served 3 prison terms, totaling almost 10 years, for forgery, larceny, and issuing fraudulent checks. In 35 years since he had left prison, his record had been spotless. In fact, the FBI had cleared him for defense-related work. More significantly, there was no reason to believe that any of his current money, including the $500,000 he had donated to the university, had been earned illegally.
Nonetheless, the newspaper's headline on the article about him, which initially was supposed to be complimentary, described him as an ex-convict. The man's wife and son, both of whom did not know of his earlier criminal record, denounced the piece as vicious, to which the paper's managing editor responded, "I think the stories simply speak for themselves." The Talmud's moral standard differs markedly from that of the paper's managing editor. If a person is a penitent, it teaches, it is forbidden to say to him, "Remember your early deeds." Needless to say, it's even more cruel to spread embarrassing reports about a person to others when his or her subsequent behavior has been exemplary. A newspaper's article was harmful to far more people than just this man and his family. It sent a very demoralizing message to everyone who has tried to redeem themselves after past misdeeds. It told them that no matter how hard they tried, whether through hard work, charitable contributions, or any form of doing good, they would forever be linked to the worst acts of their lives and could never win back their good name. Wouldn't this message alone make a person feel that there is little point in changing his ways? The irony of the message communicated by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch expose is profound. Years earlier, criminal courts had justifiably punished the man for doing evil. Now the newspaper was punishing him for doing good. This case is unusual. As a rule, reporters and newspapers rarely go out of their way to humiliate someone against whom they have no grudge. More commonly, journalists, like many of us, are apt to shame only those with whom they already are angry. The desire to humiliate adversaries is particularly common in politics. When South Carolinian Tom Turnipseed ran for Congress in 1980, his Republican rival unearthed and publicized evidence that Turnipseed had many years earlier suffered an episode of depression for which he had received electric shock treatment. When Turnipseed responded with an anguished attack on his opponent's campaign ethics, Lee Atwater, who later became famous as the director of George H.W. Bush's 1988 presidential campaign. Was then directing the Republican campaign in South Carolina, responded that he had no intention of answering charges made by a person hooked up to jumper cable. What a grotesque violation of privacy and the dictum against publicly humiliating another. Atwater put into the voters' heads a vicious, graphic image that potentially poisoned their perceptions not only of Turnipseed, but also of everyone who had had electric shock therapy. As the New York Times reporter Alina Randolph noted 20 years later, no matter how much Mr. Turnipseed talked about education or crime or dirty tricks after that, voters only saw the jumper cable. This story has a poignant postscript. 10 years later, Atwater himself was stricken with an inoperable brain tumor. Finding himself attached to unpleasant hospital machinery and facing his own mortality, he was moved to write Turnipseed a letter asking forgiveness. It is very important to me to let you know that out of everything that has happened in my career, one of the low points remains the Socala jumper cable episode. He then added, "My illness has taught me something about the notion of humanity, love, brotherhood, and relationships that I never understood and probably never would have if not for my illness. So, from that standpoint, there is some truth and good in everything." In contemporary America, one of the most prestigious professions, the law, commonly encourages its practitioners to humiliate those who oppose them in court, particularly among criminal defense lawyers. Humiliating an opposing witness is sometimes regarded as a singularly effective way to discredit testimony. Seymour Wishman, a successful and well-known criminal defense attorney, recalls a difficult defense he had to mount for a client accused of raping and sodomizing a nurse. Although Wishman had no reason to assume that the nurse had fabricated the allegation, he was very pleased when he learned that the examining police physician had neglected to mention in his medical report whether there was any physical evidence that force had been used against the nurse. This omission freed him to pursue a particularly aggressive cross-examination of the woman filled with reputation-damaging and humiliating question. "Wishman, isn't it a fact that after you met the defendant at a bar, you asked him if he wanted to have a good time?" Witness, "No, that's a lie." Wishman, "Isn't it true that you took him and his 3 friends back to your apartment and had that good time?" Witness, "No." Wishman, "And after you had that good time, didn't you ask for money?" Witness, "No such way." Wishman, "Isn't it a fact that the only reason you made a complaint was because you were furious for not getting paid?" Witness, No, that's a lie." Wishman, "You claim to have been raped and sodomized. As a nurse, you surely have an idea of the effect of such an assault on a woman's body. Are you aware that the police doctors found no evidence of force or trauma?" Witness, "I don't know what the doctors found." After the trial ended, Wishman was proud when the presiding judge congratulated him for dealing with the woman brilliantly. He felt considerably less proud half a year later when he happened to encounter the nurse at her workplace. As soon as she recognized Wishman, she started screaming, "That's the son of a bitch that did it to me." Of course, she was referring not to the alleged rape and sodomy, but to the verbal rape to which the lawyer had subjected her. According to Wishman, this encounter left him shaken and feeling somewhat guilt. What is most amazing is the lawyer's surprise at his own reaction. Why shouldn't he have felt upset? It is difficult to imagine a greater cruelty toward and humiliation of a woman than to suggest that she was a prostitute who had made a false allegation of rape because she hadn't been paid. Atwater's and Wishman's very sincere regrets, and I recognize that it was courageous of them to make their earlier actions and their repentance widely known. Bring to mind a striking image in the epilogue to George Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan. The scene is set some 25 years after Joan of Arc has been convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. When a group of people gather to discuss her impact on their lives, one man says that he feels fortunate to have been present at her execution, because having seen how dreadful it was to burn a person, he subsequently became much kinder. Must then a Christ perish in torment in every age? Another character asks, for the sake of those who have no imagination. Is it just some journalists, politicians, and lawyers who lack the empathy to understand how wrong it is to humiliate others? Apparently, many of us share and understand how wrong it is to humiliate others, because thousands of individuals are shamed by others every day. The settings in which this emotional pain is inflicted may be less public, but the damage done can be just as devastating. Take the case of a woman I know, Joanne, who is in her mid-30s and a middle manager at a large corporation. Her job includes making public addresses and briefings, but for years her professional advancement has been stunted because of her inordinate fear of public speaking. To Joanne and her many friends, her extreme nervousness has never made sense. Since she has considerable professional expertise and is very articulate about her work in one-on-one settings, they see no logical reason for her to freeze up every time she is called upon to make an address in public. In desperation, Joanne consulted a psychologist who hypnotized her. After inducing a deep state of relaxation, the psychologist instructed her to focus on any recollections or associations involving discomfort around public speaking. Joanne began to regress and was soon vividly reliving a series of episodes that had occurred when she was 7 years old. At that time, her parents had recently moved from Argentina to Brazil. Although Joanne quickly acquired an adequate grasp of Portuguese, she still made many grammatical mistakes. Unfortunately, her second-grade teacher delighted in summoning Joanne to the blackboard at the front of the classroom and questioning her on material the class had been studying. On several occasions when she answered correctly but made grammatical mistakes, the teacher would ridicule her. After a few such episodes, Joanne chose not to answer at all. "Why do you stand there like a dummy?" the teacher would ask her. "Do you expect the answer to drop down to you from God in heaven?" 25 years later, this highly accomplished adult still finds herself paralyzed when called upon to speak in front of an audience. The school teacher's gratification of a sadistic impulse left Joanne with a lifelong emotional scar. To this day, she continues to go to great and, from a career standpoint, self-destructive lengths to avoid situations where she again might be humiliated. Roberta, another woman I know, recalls a recurring and humiliating trauma from her teenage years. As a young child, she had been her mother's favorite. But when she became an adolescent and gained 20 pounds, her mother's expressions of love turned to withering verbal attacks. Once, when her aunt was visiting, Roberta brought some food to the kitchen table. As she walked away, her mother said to her aunt in a loud voice, "Do you see how big her ass is, how fat she's become? Doesn't it look disgusting? People vomit when they see her." The mother repeated this sentiment many times, often vomit when they see her. The mother repeated this sentiment many times, often in the presence of others. During her high school years, Roberta would wait until every other student had left the room when a class ended. She did not want people to see her from the back. She even started to wear a cape to school. Although she's now over 50 and her mother has long been dead, her very unhappy physical self-image remains perhaps the largest part of the legacy her mother When you've humiliated another person, the great Jewish theologian, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once said, "When I was young, I admired clever people. Now that I am older, I admire kind people." Rabbi Heschel understood that it's a greater accomplishment to be kind than to be brilliant. Harry Truman might not have been the greatest intellectual ever to occupy the office of president, but in addition to his penetrating common sense, Truman possessed kind instincts, epitomized by the extraordinary care he took not to humiliate others. In 1962, some 10 years after he left the White House, Truman was lecturing before a group of university students in Los Angeles. During the question and answer period, a student asked him, "What do you think of our local yokel?" referring to California Governor Pat Brown. Mr. Truman bristled and told the boy he should be ashamed of himself for speaking of the governor in so disrespectful a manner. He continued scolding the boy while longer. By the time he finished, the student was close to tears. What marks this story off as different from every other account until now is what happened next. When the question period was over, writes Merle Miller, author of an oral biography of the president, Mr. Truman went to the boy and said that he hoped he would understand that what he had said had to do with the principle involved, and that he meant nothing personal. The boy said that he did understand, and the two shook hands. Afterward, Mr. Truman went to see the dean to ask him to send reports from time to time on the boy's progress in school. The dean said he would. I asked Mr. Truman if he had ever heard from the boy himself, and he said, "He's written me 2 or 3 times, and I've written him back. He's doing very well." What makes Truman different from some of the political figures discussed elsewhere in this book is that he had the awareness and sensitivity to realize, not 10 years later or even 1 year later, but immediately at the public, not 10 years later or even 1 year later, but immediately at the public scolding he had given the boy. Even if the young man's words had been foolish and disrespectful, to subject him to ridicule and contempt. Imagine how different Joanne's life would have been if the teacher who had mocked her, realizing right away the unfairness and evil of what she was doing, had desisted and apologized. Other observers of Truman have noted that being attentive to others' feelings was very important to him. In 1964, when the newsman Eric Sevared interviewed him about his presidential experiences, Truman commented, "What you don't understand is the power of a president to hurt." Sevared was struck by this remark. An American president has the power to build, to set fateful events in motion, to destroy an enemy civilization. But the power of a president to hurt the feelings of another human being, this, I think, had scarcely occurred to me, and still less had it occurred to me that a president in office would have the time and need to be aware of this particular power among so many other. Mr. Truman went on to observe that a word, a harsh glance, a peremptory motion by a president of the United States could so injure another man's pride that it would remain a scar on his emotional system all his life. Guidelines for ensuring that you don't humiliate others. What was it about Harry Truman that caused him to be so conscious of the damage that words can cause? It wasn't an exceedingly mild disposition, for the many Truman biographies indicate that he was an impassioned man who did have a temper. But even when he expressed anger, what stopped him from humiliating others or caused him immediately to set out to repair the damage if he feared he had done so was his conscious internalization of the observation he made to Sevared. What you don't understand is the power of a president to hurt. Change the power of a president to the power of words, and you realize that we all have the ability to shame others. If you reflect for a few moments, you'll realize how many people you can wound verbally and perhaps already have. Your spouse, parents, other relatives, friends, or people who work for you. The first step in ensuring that you don't abuse this power is to be aware that you have it. Otherwise, you'll feel no need to guard your tongue. But while the first step must be to recognize the power of words to hurt, such recognition alone is certainly not sufficient to stop us from using words destructively. No doubt many readers have nodded as they have read each episode in this chapter, mentally acknowledging the great cruelty of shaming others. However, unless you make such an acknowledgement again and again, you will probably forget it, particularly during moments of anger. A popular British story tells of a very prominent politician who one night, having imbibed too much liquor, stumbled into a heavy-set female member of parliament from the opposition party. Annoyed, the woman said to him, "You are drunk, and what's more, you are disgustingly drunk," to which the British parliamentarian responded, "And might I say, you are ugly, and what's more, disgustingly ugly. But tomorrow I shall be sober." The story might well be apocryphal, which is yet another reason to not mention names. Few, like the politician in question, have a quick temper and pride yourself on having a sharp wit. It is important that you reflect again and again on the moral evil of shaming another person. For Lee Atwater, it was only when he was lying on his deathbed that it became obvious to him how cruel it was to have mocked one of the most painful episodes in another man's life. I am sure that had Atwater been taught throughout his life again and again, as I believe all of us must be taught again and again, that humiliating another person is as evil as going up to someone in the street and punching him in the face, he wouldn't have done so in the first place. Similarly, if my friend Roberta's mother, who jeered at her repeatedly for being overweight, had reminded herself again and again how hurtful her words could be, so much so that, 40 years later, Her daughter still looks contemptuously at herself in the mirror. Would she not have learned to curb her tongue? I suspect she would have, for Roberta is certain that her mother loved her, since she expressed many warm feelings toward her daughter on other occasions. Yet because Roberta's mother never learned to reflect on the potentially destructive power of words, she didn't feel the need to restrain her tongue when angry. She went through life like a reckless child playing with a loaded gun and never understood that words are like bullets. The damage they wreak often cannot be undone. An ancient Jewish teaching observes, it would be better for a person not to have been born at all than to experience these 7 things: the death of his children in his lifetime, economic dependence upon others, an unnatural death, forgetting his learning, suffering, slavery, and publicly shaming his fellow man. The first 6 items on this list represent some of the most horrific fates imaginable. Anyone who knows someone who has buried a child realizes that no parent ever fully recovers from such pain. Similarly, the prospect of becoming totally dependent on others, or, even worse, becoming another's slave is horrifying. As for forgetting his learning, we have all heard of people contemplating and even committing suicide after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Although most people won't take so drastic a step, I suspect that most of us would prefer to die and to go through life with severe brain damage. It's striking that the rabbis included, and publicly shaming his fellow man, on the listing of terrible occurrences. Note that they did not say, being publicly shamed, but publicly shaming his fellow man. To the rabbis, becoming the kind of malevolent human being who humiliates others is as appalling a fate as losing a child one's mind. Why? Every monotheistic faith believes that our mental capacities are God-given and that human beings were brought into this world to do good. If it is wrong to squander the gifts bestowed by God, how much worse it is to turn them to such an evil purpose as deliberately hurting another. One person who learned quite early in life the cruelty of humiliating another was the future American President Dwight Eisenhower, and the lesson he learned at 22 affected his behavior for the rest of his life. Episode, which is not well known, is related by an Eisenhower biographer, Professor Stephen Ambrose.
In the fall of 1912, third-class cadet Dwight Eisenhower was walking down a hallway at West Point when a plebe, a newly entered cadet, running full speed on some fool errand for an upperclassman, ran into him. Reacting with a bellow of astonishment and mock indignation, Eisenhower scornfully demanded, "Mr. Dumgard, a generic term for a plebe, what was your PCS previous condition of servitude?" Eisenhower then added sarcastically, "You look like a barber." The plebe's face went red. He replied softly, "I was a barber, sir." It was Eisenhower's turn to go red with embarrassment. Without a word, he returned to his room, where he told his roommate, "I'm never going to crawl haze another plebe as long as I live *. As a matter of fact, they'll have to run over and knock me out of the company before I'll make any attempt again. I've just done something that was stupid and unforgivable. I managed to make a man ashamed of the work he did to earn a living." Ambrose concludes, he never hazed again, and as an adult he never shamed a man further. He put the military hero George Patton on probation, postponed Patton's promotion to general, and ordered him to publicly apologize, specifically because Patton had humiliated and slapped a soldier suffering from shell shock and battle fatigue, and called the man a coward. Finally, remember that it is when you are most upset that you need to consider your words most carefully. Admittedly, thinking about the consequences of what you say before you say it is particularly difficult at such a time. Rabbi Judah the prince was so bothered by the smell of garlic that he didn't reflect on the shame that his words might inflict on the person who had eaten. But while Rabbi Judah was justified in being annoyed at the student's garlic breath, the punishment inflicted by his sharp words would have far outweighed the victim's crime. A more compassionate response might have been to mention the garlic, announce a 5-minute break, and ask all the students to wash out their mouth. An ancient Jewish text asks us to take care not to humiliate others even in far-fetched cases. If someone was hanged in a person's family, don't say to him, "Hang up this fish for me," lest you trigger that distressful memory or remind others who are present of the shameful event. 14. If we are supposed to be morally vigilant even in such a remote case, how much more careful should we be not to publicly mock someone's bad breath, acne, or lack of good. If you have humiliated another person, of course you should apologize to him or her. But the far more moral thing to do is to exercise restraint before you inflict shame, for the greatest remorse and the best will in the world never can erase your words. You can do everything possible to try to minimize their impact, but unfortunately, that is all you can do. Chapter 11 is lying always wrong. On the one hand, liars share with those they deceive the desire not to be deceived. Cicely Bach. Lying on the other hand, a medical professor asked his class if they thought it appropriate to tell a person that he had an illness from which he would surely die. When the professor made known his opinion that a doctor should always leave a person some room for hope, one student argued that if there was no reason for optimism, the doctor should tell the patient the full and ugly truth. The professor told the student that such an attitude made him unfit to be a physician, and that he should immediately go to the dean's office and tell him that Professor so-and-so asked that he be expelled. The devastated student started to leave, but after he had taken a few steps, the professor said, "You don't have to go to the dean's office. I just wanted you to experience for a moment the sense of pain, fear, and hopelessness your patient will feel if you tell him that he is going to die soon and there is nothing that can help him." What words should people call out as they dance in front of a bride? With this question, the Talmud inaugurates a strange debate. The school of Rabbi Hill answers that wedding guests always should exclaim, "What a beautiful and gracious bride." The school of Rabbi Shammai exclaim, "What a beautiful and gracious bride." The school of Rabbi Shammai disagrees. If she is lame or blind, are you going to say of her, "What a beautiful and gracious bride"? Does not the Torah command, "Stay far away from falsehood"? This school thus insists that no standard formula be recited. Rather, each bride should be described as she is. According to your words, the followers of Hill respond, if a person has made a bad acquisition in the market, should one praise it to him or deprecate it? Surely you would agree that one should praise it to him. Therefore, the rabbis teach one's disposition should always be pleasant with